Good evening. I'm Vicki Kennedy, and on behalf of our President, Mary Grant, and the Board of Directors, I am so pleased to welcome you to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. We're so delighted that you're all here for this very special Getting to the Point program. As I look around this room, it is so good to see so many old friends and new friends, elected officials, community leaders, and Kennedy Institute members. And it's especially wonderful to have several former members of my husband's staff who are here with us this evening. We're very grateful that you're here. I have a special word to say about one of our alums, Holly Fechner, who's sitting right there. She was especially helpful in facilitating tonight's program, and Holly, thank you so much. I'd also like to say a special word of welcome to our moderator this evening, a powerhouse lawyer, an award-winning best-selling author, and legal analyst, the legendary Jeffrey Toobin. If you're anything like me, you have loved reading his pieces in The New Yorker, and you have devoured all of his books. And if you're anything like me, you love watching him on CNN explain all of the legal issues of the day. Jeff has an almost Forrest Gump-like ability to be in the middle of the action. He won an Emmy for his coverage of the Elian Gonzalez case. He was the first to interview Martha Stewart after her insider trading investigation. He was the first to report that O.J. Simpson's defense team was going to accuse the investigators of planting evidence. And he's interviewed Supreme Court justice after Supreme Court justice after Supreme Court justice. Jeffrey Toobin is not afraid to question authority or debate or disagree with another legal expert, even if that expert happens to be one of his former professors from the Harvard Law School. As he demonstrates day in and day out, he has the courage of his convictions. And I'm reminded of that old E.F. Hutton commercial. When Jeffrey Toobin speaks, people listen. We're so happy to have you here with us tonight. When my husband first thought about creating this institute, now more than 15 years ago, he had a list of things he wanted to accomplish. First, he wanted to educate the public about the important role of the United States Senate, that place he loved so much. And he wanted to do that in an experiential, hands-on way. That's why he insisted on this replica of the United States Senate chamber. He wanted citizens to be able to walk through the door, walk onto the floor, and feel the majesty of the place, and feel the awe of knowing that there were men and women of goodwill at both parties who came together throughout our history to address the great challenges facing our nation. He wanted us all to remember that hard work of legislating. And even though he couldn't have anticipated it at the time, how much we would need this, he wanted this place to be a center for civil discourse, a place where citizens could come to discuss tough issues and learn about how to engage in principled compromise. He wanted to encourage active participation in our democracy. And by wrapping all of those things together, he hoped to inspire a new generation of leaders. Ted Kennedy believed that America is a promise, and he believed that we each have an obligation to help her live up to that promise. He believed that we're all called to fight for a more perfect union, to make America, America, as he used to say. Our featured speaker tonight, former Attorney General Eric Holder, has answered that call his entire adult life, and he has never stopped fighting for a more perfect union. A public servant for more than 30 years, an active citizen for his entire life, Eric Holder has always worked to make a difference. He started working as a young trial lawyer in the public integrity section of the Department of Justice right out of Columbia Law School. It was through his stellar work at DOJ that he caught the eye of President Ronald Reagan, who nominated him to be a judge on the Superior Court in DC. And because we're in the Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, I have to say that he was confirmed by a majority of the Senate to that position as judge. As a Superior Court judge, our Speaker again distinguished himself, catching the eye this time of a new young president named Bill Clinton. President Clinton nominated him first to be the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and then, once he finished that term, to be Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Again, for both of those positions, he was confirmed by the Senate, and he served with distinction. At the end of his term as Deputy AG, our Speaker became a partner in the Washington office of the prestigious Covington law firm. But when his candidate, and mine, was elected president, he was again called upon to serve his nation. In 2009, President Barack Obama nominated Eric Holder to be Attorney General of the United States, where he served for the full 8 years of the Obama administration. He's now back in the private sector at his old law firm. But when it comes to Eric Holder, you can take the man out of public office, but you can't take the public service out of the man. Our Speaker has never stopped asking what he can do for his country. And he has stayed involved in what Oliver Wendell Holmes called the actions and passions of our time. As the head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, he's speaking out on the dangers of gerrymandering, of drawing congressional districts in ways that disenfranchise voters and unfairly stack the deck for the political party in power. As he has said, politicians shouldn't choose voters. Voters should choose their representatives. I know you can't wait to hear him, neither can I, so without further ado, please welcome him now, the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. And please welcome Jeffrey Toobin.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to just give General Holder the chance to recover a little while from sitting in Mitch McConnell's usual seat. So, and then...
I knew there was something going on there. I couldn't quite figure out what it was.
Okay, we have a lot to discuss. I just can tell that this audience is not just interested in gerrymandering. So we're going to talk about gerrymandering.
Are there other things going on?
I think there are a few, but we're going to start by talking about gerrymandering. What is gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering is, as we all know, we have congressional and state districts that are drawn. Gerrymandering is the drawing of those districts for partisan advantage so that the party in power maintains its power and makes it close to impossible for the opposition party to gain that seat at the state level or at the federal level.
And is that a bad thing?
Yeah, I think it's a really bad thing. If one looks at the results of the gerrymandered system that we have now at the federal level, for instance, I think a large part of the dysfunction that we see in Washington, D.C. is as a result of gerrymandering, where people are in safe districts, Republicans in safe districts, and not concerned about a general election, more concerned about a primary election. And therefore, people drift to the ideological extremes. Compromise doesn't happen. Compromise, the likes of which, Ted Kennedy stood for, a solid progressive who had the ability to reach across the aisle. You don't see that anymore as a result of gerrymandering.
Now, the term gerrymandering comes from Elbridge Gerry, who was a governor of Massachusetts in the early...
It's all your fault.
Yeah, that's right. But in the early days of the Republic, so this is not a new phenomenon, a new issue. But is it worse now than it used to be?
Yeah, Princeton did a study that indicated, they looked at what happened in 2011 when the Republicans really went to town with regard to gerrymandering and declared it the worst gerrymandering of the last half century. And we have seen the results of that over the course of this past decade, where we have at both the state level and the federal level governments that are in place, legislatures that are in place that are doing things inconsistent with the will of the people, inconsistent with positions that the people want their representatives to take.
But why is it, I mean, politicians have always wanted to be reelected. That's not a new phenomenon. So why is gerrymandering worse now? Why are candidate or representatives able to gerrymander with greater precision, and why are they more motivated to do it now than they were, say, 20 years ago or 100 years ago?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure the motivation is not the same, although we had the 2010 election, the shellacking, as President Obama called it, and Republicans took advantage of that 2010 shellacking, and then with the technology that we now have that didn't exist before, we're able to craft these districts with the kind of precision that I don't think you had the ability to do before you had computers and all the other kinds of software and hardware that we now possess. So the combination of that that huge electoral defeat in 2010, combined with the technology that now exists, led to, as Princeton described, the worst gerrymandering of the last half century.
So, you know, what gerrymandering means in practical terms, like just looking ahead to the 2018 election, it won't be enough for Democrats to get more votes than Republicans. Elaborate on what it means in a practical sense for the 2018 election.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there is going to be a blue wave, okay? I think Democrats are going to do pretty well. Well, yeah. But here comes the bad news. Here comes the bad news. That wave is going to run into these gerrymandered districts. The Brennan Center has estimated that for Democrats, for instance, to take over the House of Representatives, and because of gerrymandered districts, they have to win by 11%. Some have said that number is too high. It should only be 7%. Well, think about that. You know, it should be kind of 51%, right? But 57%, 61%, something along those lines. And you see an example of that in Virginia last year, where Democrats got over, there was a 10-point differential between what the vote for Democrats and Republicans, and yet Democrats were unable to take over the General Assembly in Virginia. That's the place where we had the coin toss in 51-49, in spite of the fact that Democrats got 10% more votes. Wisconsin, the Supreme Court case that's now being considered, after the gerrymandering in 2011 and 2012 election, Republicans got less than 50% of the vote and got 67% of the state legislative seats and 67% of the congressional delegation. And so this blue wave is going to go into that gerrymandered system, and we'll see what ultimately happens.
What do you say to the people who explain phenomenon like that? And they say, well, that is, oh, sure, they acknowledge gerrymandering exists, but they also say that we now live in politically polarized locations, is that Democrats are heavily concentrated in cities, and so that means, you know, the districts in Boston, the, you know, young Congressman Kennedy, he's actually not in Boston, he's on the outs, but, you know, these Democratic districts, people win with 80 and 90% of the votes. That's not because of how the district lines are drawn, it's just because of where people live now.
No, that's at least that's a part of the issue, but it is not the part, it is not as significant as people would say. There's a great article, and I would recommend this to everybody. It's called The 5 Myths of Gerrymandering. It's by Ari Berman. And the first one that first myth that he explodes is this notion of Democrats are all clustered on one block in every city, you know, and that's why they can't get appropriate representation. It's a factor, but it is not nearly the factor that everybody makes out. If you look at, scientists looked at the maps that were drawn in Wisconsin. I keep going back to Wisconsin, and they said if you control for everything else, the reason that you had the disparities there was not the location of Democrats, it was the way in which the lines were drawn. That's the thing more than anything that controls.
Okay, so you are now the leader, and President Obama is very much involved with the National Democratic Redistricting Committee.
I'd almost like to say I'm his boss, but that's not the case.
Yeah,
I'd like to be able
you
to
can,
say
you
that,
can
but
dream.
that's not true.
A guy can dream. What is it?
The NDRC is really the attempt by the Democratic Party to establish a fair system. It is not an attempt to gerrymander for Democrats. This is a partisan attempt at good government. My view is that if we have a fair redrawing of the districts in 2021, after we have a fair census in 2010, and we can talk about that, the Democrats, progressives will do fine as opposed to Republicans and conservatives. We just want to have the system done, or the lines drawn in 2021 in a fair way. Now, we're coming at it in a number of ways. We are filing lawsuits where that's appropriate. We're supporting candidates who are dedicated to having a more fair system. We're working with grassroots efforts, Organizing for Action, which is the successor to Obama for America. We're working with them. We're also supporting reform efforts. If you look at California and Arizona, where they have nonpartisan commissions that are actually responsible for drawing the lines, I actually think that's the best of all possible worlds. And where that is possible, we are supporting efforts in that regard. That is being considered in Utah, Colorado, Michigan. There was an attempt to think about it in Ohio. Republicans got so concerned about a ballot initiative there that they actually compromised with Democrats and came up with a system that was just approved by the voters that is actually going to make the redistricting process in Ohio much more fair.
There are two cases before the Supreme Court now, one out of Wisconsin, and there's a reason why you keep mentioning Wisconsin, because it is really the most egregious. I mean, you have a system there where Democrats get somewhere in the 57% of the vote for state legislature, and they have 40% of the seats. I mean, it's just egregiously disproportionate. That's one case that has been argued we should hear a decision by the end of June. Similar case out of Maryland, a Democratic gerrymander. How much is your work dependent on the good guys, as you see it, winning those two lawsuits?
It would certainly help to have the Supreme Court say that the Wisconsin legislature went too far, and that the Democrats went too far in Maryland. But even if there is a loss, even if we lose, if the good guys lose, it depends on how the opinion is written and whether there'll be certain language there. But we also have, as I said, these other things that we are doing. We have direct electoral support of candidates who are committed to this effort. There's a reform angle that we are trying, so that it would have an impact potentially. Depends on what the language is in the opinion. It could have an impact on our litigation prospects. But it wouldn't cripple the effort that is underway.
Now, I've covered those cases for a long time as they've worked their way through the courts. And this issue, I mean, it was before the court. The Pennsylvania, there was a case called Veith in 2006 that was a case that I covered. And one of the problems your side has always had in telling the justices is, well, okay, we know that the system is bad now, that this partisan gerrymandering is out of control. But the districts are always going to be drawn by politicians. What's a good standard? What's the constitutional standard that would allow the courts not to be involved in reviewing every single redistricting that goes on, but is consistent with the Constitution? How do you draw a good standard?
Yeah, I mean, that actually is, I think in some way will be the deciding thing in the case. I think you've got a court that's probably at 4-4, and the question is, where is Justice Kennedy, who has said, or hinted.
It's a familiar situation.
It's a familiar
for the court.
situation, yeah. Who's kind of hinted that that partisan gerrymandering can go too far, but has said the same thing. Well, but how do I measure that? Well, out of the Wisconsin case, there's this thing called the efficiency gap, which gets really complicated. So that is one tool. But if you also look at or read, as I did, the oral arguments, you see Justice Breyer. I think he's asking a question of counsel, but I actually think he's talking to Justice Kennedy when he talks about there are a number of factors that can be considered in making a determination about whether a redistricting scheme has gone too far. I mean, you look at things like communities of interest, what the shape of the district looks like. In Pennsylvania, there was that famous Goofy kicking Donald or Donald kicking Goofy district. I mean, you look at some of these things and they are really, really bizarre. You have some districts that are, there's one in Virginia, it's only contiguous at high tide, you know, when the James River is, you know, I'd like to think I'm making this stuff up, but I'm not. And so there are a number of factors. There is the efficiency gap that I think would give the court the tools, if they are so inclined, to say that what Wisconsin did and what Democrats did in Maryland was unconstitutional.
Well, and I completely agree that that was a key moment in the oral argument when Breyer basically said, you know, we don't need to deal with all, you know, Supreme Court justices, they don't like math. That's why they went to law school, not other kinds of...
That's why I went to law school.
Right, yeah.
You know?
And you know, the efficiency gap, they're like percentages and Greek letters, and they're like nervous about that. But one of the things Justice Breyer said is you look and see if both parties participated in drawing the lines. And if only one party participated in drawing the lines, that's a factor that indicates that it might be unconstitutional.
Yeah, and with regard to some of the more egregious stuff, I mean, if you look at North Carolina, Wisconsin, you can't even say that the entire Republican Party participated in some of that line drawing. You know, a small group of the party went into literally like a smoke-filled room, worked out the line drawing, and then came out and shared it with their colleagues. There's a guy who was a staffer in Wisconsin who was in the room and was so disgusted by what he saw, he quit his job and said that he didn't want to be a part of you know, of such an effort. And so it's you know, this is something I think we can do. I think we can by 2021 get to a place where we can be successful in 2018, because 50% of the people who will be doing the line drawing in 2021 will be elected in this year, and then 2 years from now, the other 50% will be elected. That is governors and state legislators. I think that we have the capacity to have a very substantial impact on both the elections in 2018 and in 2020, and have a fair process in 2021.
And just to emphasize how important the elections of 2018 are, I mean, you have states that were unbelievably gerrymandered. I mean, after the shellacking of 2010, you have governors up in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Florida. I mean, those states alone could just make a huge difference in terms of control, I mean, just because they're big, important states.
Yeah, and we've identified, and we did a state-by-state analysis to determine where was gerrymandering at its in its most egregious form, and then what states would have the greatest impact if we were successful. And we've identified 12 states, so you have 7 states on our watch list that we are working on, and there are the states you would expect: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Colorado, Nevada, I don't know what number, but those are the states that we have focused on, where if we are successful, it can have a national impact.
And so you are trying to both, you know, legal remedies if that's appropriate, and obviously we'll see what the Supreme Court does. You might be able to file lawsuits based on what the Supreme Court does, but there are elected officials who are not necessarily the highest profile people, like state legislators, like secretaries of state, who have an outsized influence in this area.
And when we did that analysis, we did a state-by-state view of who are the people, in terms of our direct electoral efforts, who are the people who play the biggest role. Governors always matter, state legislators always matter, but you're right. In Ohio, the state secretary of state and the state auditor matter a great deal. In Wisconsin, the Supreme Court has an outsized influence. It's one of the reasons why I went to Wisconsin to campaign for a woman, Rebecca Dallett, who won an election there, first Democrat to win a Wisconsin Supreme Court seat in an off-year election since 1995. But so we've identified who are the people in each of these states, and we will be supporting those candidates.
Let me just ask you a sort of political question about your former boss, President Obama, who was, you know, very much involved in your project. You know, one of the facts about the Obama era was that though President was elected and reelected, many Democrats lost. 900, I think, seats is the number of elected officials at the state level. You know, there's a net loss of 900 seats to Democrats under President Obama. Do you think that's one reason he's particularly involved in this?
No, I actually think that he sees it as I see it. I think that it is not And when I say this, I say this in a very considered way. I think our democracy is under attack. If you look at the whole Russia rule of law thing, I mean, that's one thing, but we'll kind of push that aside. That's a substantial thing, but for now, just put that aside. But you look at this whole problem with gerrymandering, voter suppression, these voter ID laws, the way in which our country has thought of itself and tried to design our representative democracy, that idea, I think, is under attack. And I think that's what motivates President Obama. Although he's a competitive guy, and I think he looks back at that and he wants to make sure that, for this president and his first, after his first midterm election, is as bad for this president as it was for Barack Obama. Another shellacking is what we're looking for,
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the Department of Justice, moving more broadly.
I got the sense we want to go there at some point.
Well, you obviously, you were Attorney General, but this is a big chunk of your life. It's not just your time as Attorney General, as a trial lawyer, as U.S. Attorney, as Deputy Attorney General. I mean, this is decades of your life. When there's a new president, particularly a new president from a different party, I think we all expect that there will be certain policy changes. How much of what's going on in the Department of Justice is sort of the normal ebb and flow of one party to another, and how much is just radically different?
I'm not sure I see anything that is ebb and flow. Everything, it is radical. There were certain things that when I came into office that I did differently than my predecessor. I think about John Ashcroft and his successors in the Bush administration. But the wholesale changes that Jeff Sessions is doing as Attorney General, I think are inconsistent with the Justice Department at its best. I mean, there's certain norms, and I think that's one of the problems that we have with this administration. They're wearing down certain norms. If you look at the way in which they're looking at criminal justice reform issues that basically have bipartisan support. I mean, when we were pretty close to a bill, Democrats, Republicans, I remember we had a meeting in my office, and we had the Center for American Progress, the ACLU, representatives from the Koch brothers, and the Tea Party. And I remember walking into my conference room, and I remember thinking, you remember the bar scene from Star Wars? And it was kind of, it was one of those things, And I remember telling the DOJ photographer, get up here, So he gets up to the 5th floor, and I said, come on, let's take a picture, guys. And, they didn't want to get too close to one another. Yeah. But there was a consensus view that criminal justice reform made a great deal of sense. Conservatives thought of it as a failed government program. People on the progressive side viewed it from a moral perspective. And one of the few people who didn't support it was Jeff Sessions. But now he's Attorney General, and he wants to take, I think, the country back to what I would consider the failed policies of the 80s, where you lock up as many people as you can for as long as you can, and you forget the science, basically, that has shown that there are different ways, there are better ways to keep the American people safe. So that is just an example, I think, of the kind of radical change that he has inflicted on the nation through his power at the Justice Department.
One of your signatures, particularly in the latter stages of your tenure as Attorney General, was voting rights, and lawsuits that your Civil Rights Division filed in Texas and North Carolina, lawsuits that were withdrawn by the current Justice Department. Talk about what issues are at stake with voting rights.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about radical. I mean, we sued Texas on a number of voting rights issues. The Trump administration comes into office, and Sessions basically takes the Justice Department from the plaintiff side to the Texas side. Now, interestingly, none of the people who signed that new brief were career people in the Justice Department. And I think there's probably a story there, that the Civil Rights Division, the voting section, none of those people's names are on that brief. Voting rights is, you think about the 65 Voting Rights Act, which is the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. You think about people who gave their lives so that everyone would have the right to vote. Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, those 3 civil rights workers, were out there to register people to vote. This is a precious, precious thing. And for one party to make it more difficult for people to vote, to put up this notion, put out this false notion of voter fraud, to try to justify these unnecessary voter ID laws that have a negative impact on, people who are more traditionally democratic, I think puts the Republican Party on the wrong side of history, and they're going to be judged, I think, extremely, extremely harshly. But gerrymandering is also something that will allow, assuming we have a fair vote in a fair process in 2021, allow for the reversal, I think, for a lot of that and get our system back on track.
In fairness to the current Justice Department, it wasn't just
we don't have to be fair.
No, but let me finish the question.
I was fair in my assessment.
It was also the Supreme Court that hurt you a great deal.
Oh yeah.
When it comes to the Shelby County case,
Right.
Maybe you might tell the folks, remind folks, and I don't know if it's good or bad, but to have your name, the title of the case is Shelby County versus Holder. What does that mean? And we'll just talk about the case and its significance.
All right, so you already made me angry because you just mentioned the fact that my name is on that opinion. I mean, it's the equivalent of Dred Scott versus Holder. You don't want your name ever associated with that case. And so people who work with me at the NDRC know that we only call it the Shelby County case. But in the Shelby County case, the court wrongly, I think, gutted the Voting Rights Act. It really took the Justice Department out of the process in a way that I thought had really been beneficial by taking out the pre-clearance ability that the Justice Department had in certain states to protect the voting rights of people, moving polling places, changing the way in which elections are held, in these voter ID laws. Those things had to be pre-cleared with regard to certain states. And other parts of entire states and then parts of other states. And by taking that power away from the department, we saw, as I think Justice Ginsburg predicted, these states just going to town with these unnecessary voter ID laws. So you're right. It's not just what's going on at the Justice Department. The foundation, I think, in some ways was laid by that really terrible Supreme Court case. And I think the court should think about this. The justices should think about this. You've got Citizens United, I think a terrible decision. You've got Shelby County, a terrible decision. You potentially have them adding to that, making this a trio of cases if they decide the gerrymandering case incorrectly. And Chief Justice Roberts is a person who I think has a sense of history and thinks about how the court should be viewed for historical purposes. I think in some ways those would be the electoral equivalent, the Democratic electoral equivalent of some of those economic cases that were passed by or decided by the Supreme Court that almost derailed the New Deal. And I think, as I said, Chief Justice Roberts should keep that in mind as he's looking at this last case.
We've talked a lot. We've talked now about policy, about voting rights, but there's also a personal dimension that's going on here, that's going on now with the relationship between the president and the Justice Department and the president's, all right, just go. We all know where I'm going, so just go ahead and,
When we were in the green room, I'm not sure exactly what the context was, but Vicki, you were saying, it's hard to believe this. You can't make this stuff up. And that is, I think, where we are now. I mean, can you imagine, all right, Barack Obama saying about me the things that Donald Trump has said about Jeff Sessions?
You don't resemble Mr. Magoo at all. And he calls Jeff Sessions Mr. Magoo, I know.
Well, or any president with his attorney general saying these kinds of things. I talked earlier about this notion of norms. The best justice departments are the ones that are independent. And the justice departments that are not independent, do not value that independence, are the ones that get into trouble. You saw that during the Nixon years, you saw that during the George W. Bush years. And the attempt by this president to think of the attorney general, I guess, as his lawyer and people in the Justice Department as his attorneys, is inconsistent with, I think, Justice Departments that function best, and also inconsistent with that norm. I mean, the Justice Department has the ability to indict people, deprive people of their liberty, and as a result of that, you don't want that power to somehow be seen as a function of political whims, political desires. And yet this president will tweet, investigate this person, prosecute this person. We have never seen that before. They might have said this, Nixon might have said these kinds of things privately. We see that on the tapes. But this is a president who is saying these things through the use of Twitter, I guess rallies that he does. He's saying these things publicly. And that has a really negative impact on people's perception of our justice system, and will have a long-term negative impact. To the extent that you are attacking the institutions like justice, like the FBI, at times, jurors have to make credibility determinations. FBI agent says one thing, defendant says another thing. In the past, we're always concerned that people would give too much weight to an FBI agent simply because that person was an FBI agent. Now, at least through what President Trump has done, there's the possibility that doubt will be existent in the minds of jurors as they look at an FBI agent.
Again, the norm thing. This is my own pet obsession. When we saw the rallies in the 2016 campaign where they were chanting, lock him up, lock her up about Hillary Clinton, the idea that you should call for the investigation, the imprisonment of your political opponents, that's something new at least in recent American political history, isn't it?
Yeah, it's new in American history, but we've seen it before in other parts of the world. And I don't want to be too alarmist, but Steve Schmidt, who's a Republican operative, said something I thought was pretty profound, that if you look at Europe in the 30s, you saw that authoritarian regimes took over not because they were strong, but because democracies were weak. And we should not delude ourselves into thinking that we can lose the country that we have. We can lose the country that we revere, the country that we love. It can slip into something that is fundamentally different from that which has existed for over 200 years. And so on a day-by-day basis, I think that the American people have to become more active, more engaged, have to be in opposition where that is appropriate. We've seen those young people from Florida marching in Washington, D.C., seeing women march the day after the inauguration. That's where we have to be as Americans. We use the power that we have as citizens to be in opposition to those who would do things that would undermine our American system.
You were Deputy Attorney General. I think it is safe to say you were not the most famous Deputy Attorney General. Rod Rosenstein has become a very famous person in the last year. What do you think it's like for him to be asked to restrict the Mueller investigation, to disclose evidence as he did recently? Talk about the pressures that he must be facing. And he was U.S. Attorney in Maryland when you were Attorney General. So do you have impressions of him as a prosecutor, as a lawyer, as a person?
Sure. I've known Rod probably 20, 25 years, something like that. He's a man of integrity. He's a straight shooter. He's got an extremely difficult job. There's always a tension between the Justice Department and Congress about turning over documents, talking about ongoing investigations, but there's certain lines that you never cross. I faced and was held in contempt by the House because I wouldn't turn over certain documents related to an investigation that we had conducted because, again, you can go so far. You try to compromise, but then you draw certain lines. What worries me here is that I like Rod. I like Rod a lot, but I think that he's making decisions now where you're giving up too much. Again, we're erasing some of these norms, and you're setting precedents, and doing it to try to appease a Congress that's asking for things that I think are inappropriate, potentially to try to get a president off your back. The president says that he wants an investigation done. And so Rod sends something to the Inspector General. You know, that's just not the way it goes. I mean, I think my first reaction would have been to say, all right, first I'll ignore him. Okay, let's see if maybe this just goes away. And then at some point, though, you've got to tell the president no. I mean, as Attorney General, in your conference room, you have the ability to put up 4 of your predecessors' portraits. I had Bobby Kennedy, Edward Levy, who put the Justice Department back together after Watergate, a Republican, Janet Reno, and on the left in the back I had Elliot Richardson, to remind me that as Attorney General, there may come a time when I've got to say no to the president. And the reality is that the job is not as important as the duties that you have, the responsibilities that you have. And I am concerned that Rod's gone a little too far in erasing some of those norms.
The president has cited you by name as saying, well, he did whatever President Obama wanted. Did you say no to President Obama?
Well, let's put it like this. There were things that I did that he did not know about until we probably told him before things went to the press. And he's indicated there are at least 2, 3 things that I did that he didn't agree with. But he's never told me what those 2, 3 things were. And certainly, he said, I'm not going to share that with you. Certainly, well, we're in office here. And I remember I left before he did. So you can tell me now. He said, no, I'm not going to tell you. So maybe I'll read about them in his book. But yeah, there are things that, there are things I think that perhaps, he would have wanted to have had done differently. But that wasn't, his responsibility. It was mine as Attorney General. And one of the things I appreciated about him was that he understood that the best Justice Departments are the ones that have that appropriate degree of independence. And so we never heard things from the White House in the way that this Justice Department hears from this president.
Before we go to questions from the audience, just a couple more. There's a recent controversy going on involving immigration where parents have been separated from children coming across the border, and the president has said, and other members of the administration have said, well, this is an Obama policy and a Democratic policy, and we think Congress should change this. This is not something we did. What's your reaction to that?
Okay, so I can't use the word that I want to use, but it starts with B. Yeah. It's nonsense. I mean, and in some, this is among those lists of fabrications, falsehoods, alternative facts. This is pretty high on the list. This is a policy determination that this administration has made to separate children from families as a way to try to thwart people who are trying to come to this country either illegally or seeking asylum. There are these things called family detention centers that kind of anticipate the notion that people are coming with their kids and they are there so that you don't have to break up families. So those can be made use of. And to the extent that there is this law that would require it, well, there's a law that says that if you come here and you're criminally prosecuted for crossing the border, well, then your kids can't necessarily go into the federal prison system with you. But the determination that they have made to criminally prosecute everybody who is coming across the border is one of the reasons why they end up in this situation. So it's a question of policy. And this has never happened before. And in a lot of ways, breaking that norm puts our government in a very, very bad light. Our government is separating kids, some I've read as young as 18 months, from their parents. And then you lose track of 1,500 of them, all in the name of, I think, a misguided immigration policy. So this is, I think, government at its worst, and not anything that the Democrats or the Obama administration put in place.
Okay. Before we go to the audience, are you going to run for president in 2020? I think that counts as encouragement.
Well, no, I'm looking around here. That was about a 30, 40%. And with this crowd, I would have hoped for something substantially greater than that, you know? I don't know. You know, I've said that, you know, I'm thinking about it. I'm focused now on the NDRC.
There we go.
Well, on the basis of that response, I have an announcement to make. No, but I'm thinking about it, but it's something I'll decide, I think, in the early part of next year.
Fair enough. Now, how are we going to do question? You want to raise somebody up? We want to include the gallery. Okay, go find someone with their hand raised. In the woman in red in the corner. Well, I don't think the microphone is on. That's the other. But just talk loud.
So, thank you very much for coming, first of all. It is a real pleasure to be in your presence. And I have a question that is not going to happen maybe in our lifetimes, but if there were ever to come a day when we had national voting standards, do you think that that would help things?
If we had national voting standards.
What do you mean? You mean? Yeah, how would you like, if you had the power for federal legislation on voting, and you know, and a Congress that was amenable, what do you think you would do?
Ooh, okay. Well, I think some of the mechanics that you talked about are things that I would consider. Making sure that we had machines that had a paper trail, trying to harden our systems against what I think are inevitable further attacks by the Russians or others. Coming up with a way in which we would find we wouldn't hold elections just on, you know, this first Monday, first Tuesday, whatever it is in November. I mean, you know, that goes back to agrarian.
It is the first Tuesday. I think you knew that.
Yeah. That goes back to agrarian times, and we're no longer an agrarian society. And so, you know, expanding the time in which people have the ability to vote, and the ways in which people can vote, always taking into account that we have to have, you know, the ballot security. Those are the kinds of things that I would want to do. You know, make registration far easier than it is now. Substantial numbers of our population are unregistered, and in some ways that is one of the biggest impediments to getting people to participate in the process. So those are the kinds of things that if I had the kind of power that you've talked about, that I think I would, that's the way I'd want to use it.
Okay. Next question from the audience, from the balcony. Over there, yes.
Oh, no, I guess that doesn't work either.
It's on.
So, oh, is it?
There we go.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
I'm not a public speaker, so I don't typically know how these work. First of all, I want to thank you for coming here. I also want to thank you for your example as a public servant. I'm an attorney with the federal government, and it's kind of difficult to, here in Boston, and it's kind of difficult to look around and look at attorneys misbehaving, both in the private and the public sector. So thank you for your example. I really appreciate it. My question, it might be similar to the one the woman just asked, but so our right to vote is guaranteed in the Constitution, but elections are run locally. And I'm not really sure why, other than the agrarian society, but does it make sense to continue to do that? And if not, then what can we do? Obviously, you're going to still have local state elections, but as far as the federal elections go. And I just wondered if that was a solution to the gerrymandering.
Yeah, I mean, I think there, you know, you can do a lot, Congress can do a lot with regard to how elections are run for federal offices, less ability to impact or direct with regard to state and local elections. But, you know, in some ways, I'm not necessarily offended by or bothered by the notion that states have the ability to do things on their own because they have the ability to experiment. It's one of the beauties of our federal system. It's also, one of the concerns if states, as you've seen since 2011, if they use that power inappropriately. But using the states as laboratories, some states are allowing people to vote, by mail. New technologies brought into use. Studying what happens there and then having states give states the ability to follow, best practices. I think that's a good part of our system. But, some degree of uniformity, I think, would help. If we had some kind of like base level standards below which states could not go, I think that'd be a good thing.
But your redistricting commission sort of accepts the system as it is, and you are working on a state-by-state basis, right? You are not trying for a universal solution.
No, we are dealing with the system as we find it, working state by state, with the hope that if we are successful and if we have people committed to, a more fair system, that after 2021, a lot of the things that we have talked about here might be put in place by state legislatures.
Yes, over there.
Hello, thank you for coming, and it's really inspiring to watch you come here and speak to us. My question kind of deters from everyone. I know that yesterday Starbucks closed their 8,000 stores for addressing everyday racism, and obviously cost like $10 million loss in profit. So I know you're involved in addressing that whole issue. So what are you doing? What are you going to do going forward after yesterday?
Well, I think that, first what happened in Philadelphia in that Starbucks store, people should not think that that's a Starbucks problem, That's a problem that this nation has to confront. And until, we all carry unconscious bias with us, and that's irrespective of your skin color. And until we get at that problem, until we have, I think, the necessary conversations, until we are honest with ourselves and face some difficult truths about who we are as a nation, we've made progress. There's no question about that. The nation that existed before, as Ted Kennedy went into the Senate, is fundamentally different because of his work, than when he left. We've made substantial progress, but we're not the more perfect union or the perfect union that we need to be. Now, I'm working with Starbucks, and the thing that I like about the approach that they've taken was that they said straight away, this was a problem, reprehensible act should not have happened. We're going to close our stores. I'd lose $20 million or so, I guess, for that closure. But said that this is simply because we're doing this training on one day. This is only step one. That we're going to continue this. The CEO has said that this is the first step in a journey, and I think that that's really what has to happen. I would hope that we would use the Starbucks problem and what happened there as maybe an indication of what this nation could do, and talk about race in ways that too frequently we do not. It is a painful topic to talk about given our history, and we become expert at avoiding, racial conversations. I gave a speech in 2009 when I was a newly minted Attorney General at Black History Month speech, and I said we were a nation of cowards because we don't confront each other. We don't talk about racial issues. I read that speech actually a couple of weeks ago. It still holds up pretty well. But
it was controversial when you gave it.
It was very controversial, and people think I said we're a nation of cowards, and I just sat down. It actually talks about a whole variety of things, and among the things that I talked about was the need for greater dialogue, and then action based on that dialogue. But we should not think that that's a Starbucks problem. That's actually an American problem that can be fixed. We have the ability to change those long-held attitudes.
Is there something I've been struck by is that traditionally we have thought of civil rights as something sort of the government imposes on the corporate world, but we now have sort of a paradoxical moment where Starbucks is taking the lead on race, where the Disney Corporation said we can't have Roseanne. We had pharmaceutical companies in Indiana. But pharmaceutical companies in Indiana saying to then Governor Mike Pence, we can't discriminate against gay people like you're trying to do. What is that with this paradox of the corporations being ahead of the government?
Well, I think, corporate America sees that in order for them to be successful in this changing demography that is America, that you've got to be respectful, you've got to be inclusive, and it has an impact on the bottom line. I mean, there have been studies that show that the companies that are more diverse do better than their competitors, and so there is a bottom line component there. But I also think in some ways that corporations are, because of maybe the interactions that they have with citizens, are getting maybe a touch. They're more in touch perhaps with their customers than maybe these gerrymandered representatives have with their constituents. And so therefore they're putting in place and being more sensitive to these issues than people in government are.
Did you have a question here down in the...
Hi.
The senator from wherever you are. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm so short, it won't make any difference, but thank you for coming. And the first thing I wanted to say before I ask the question is, please run in 2020. Please. The question
I
is...
refuse to. Oh, you were talking to him. I'm sorry. All right.
Vice President. Sir. If Donald Trump, he started to lean on Sessions again and say the things he said to him, and if Sessions folds and decides to resign, or Trump goes even crazier than he is now and fires him, and Rod Rosenstein is in charge, you said you've known him for 20 or 25 years, do you think if Trump asked him to fire Mueller, do you think he would?
No. I don't think that, I know Rod. I would be shocked if he would give in to a demand or an order by the president to do that, in the absence of some indication that Bob Mueller, who I've known probably longer than I've known Rod, and in the absence of some indication that Bob Mueller had done something improper, inappropriate. I think Rod would see that as a red line, and it's certainly a red line that I see. I mean, the removal of Bob Mueller is a red line for me. And I remember tweeting about that and saying that is one of those things that, in a peaceful way, should direct the American people to the streets if that happens.
Let's talk about Mueller for a minute, because he reported to you as when he was head of the FBI. You were the
FBI is technically a part of the Justice Department. Technically.
Right. But talk about what kind of person he is and what you think that means for this investigation.
Bob is a straight shooter. He is a person who has served this country well for as long as, as you described my career, Victoria. And Bob's also a Republican, I mean, so this notion that somehow or other, it's Democrats are out to get this president. You've got people who are all Republicans in the critical positions with regard to this investigation. He's a tough guy. He's a war hero, a Marine who served in Vietnam. I don't think, quite frankly, that the likes of Donald Trump are going to scare him an awful lot. He's going to do his job. And I think he's going to make calls on the basis of the facts, the law as it should be applied to those facts. I think that we are on what I've come to call the path of inevitability. There's going to be a moment at which they're just going to be head-to-head, and I don't think that this president's got the self-control. He is so self-interested that I think that we're going to be in a constitutional crisis at some point.
Wow. Okay. Up there, right there, yeah.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Attorney General here. I've got my son, Ray Barack Thomas, with me, who wanted to... He's 10 years old. He was born in April of 2008, if that tells you anything. But he wanted to tell you about his redistricting idea, but he's a little shy, and he wanted to know if there would be time afterwards for him to come down.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
I'll be more than willing to steal a good idea from a 10-year-old and probably not give him credit, you know? For sure, come on. We can
He's definitely running with that answer.
stealing from a 10-year-old?
There you go.
Good afternoon, and I'd like to extend a appreciation for your service to the country. I am a 73-year-old, as opposed to 10, U.S. Army veteran of Vietnam. We veterans would like to know why we spend so much money on the front end and so little on taking care of the veterans. As a member of a post-agrarian society, my only question to both you is, Electoral College, why?
Okay, yeah.
Well, we're going to deal with gerrymandering first, and then we get to the Electoral College. The Electoral College has outlived whatever usefulness it had. You know, I'm not sure it ever was useful. You know, it's born in sin, has to do with the 3/5 compromise and all of that. It has failed us twice, I guess, in the last 5 elections. Failed us meaning that the person who got the greatest number of the popular votes did not become president. And I think it needs to be done away with. Now, that would require, you know, a constitutional amendment. But there's this other mechanism, a compact, that is being worked out between the states, where each state would agree that it would cast its electoral votes not for who won the state, but who won the greater number of votes on a national basis. And we're up to states in electoral votes of 170. It only goes into effect when enough states say they will do that, and the number gets to 270, enough to elect a president. I think that's maybe the way in which you can actually render the Electoral College the useless thing that it is. And actually, it's more than useless. I think the pernicious thing that it actually is. Because, you know, you have, with all due respect to, you know, some of these smaller states, you have these swing states, as they are called, where candidates spend huge amounts of time. But it would be a good thing if we had you decide an election on the basis of the national popular vote. You would have Democrats campaigning in Texas. You would have Republicans campaigning in New York and in California. You would have a true national election. And I think for that one office, that's something that we as a nation should move to.
I think the woman in white hair here will unfortunately have the last question. A lot of pressure.
My question is about immigration. I'd like to know where this hostility toward immigrants has come and who is feeding it, because if you walk around Boston, every window has a help wanted sign. So the notion that we should only have scientists and techies makes no sense, but there seems to be an overwhelming opposition to immigrants.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, first we should remember, we always say that we're a melting pot, we're a nation of immigrants, and we are a nation of immigrants. Unless you are a Native American, you know, an American Indian, you are of immigrant stock. Everybody here, you know. Now, if your folks came over on the Mayflower and you're the waspiest person in the world, you are of immigrant stock. And the question just really is, how far back does it go? You know, for me, it's my father. My mother's parents were both immigrants. And so the question is, you know, is it your grandparents or great-grandparents, or does it go further back? We all come from someplace else to this nation that we call America. And unlike what the president said, we don't get the worst of other nations. You know, now there are exceptions, they're gonna, you know, yeah. But we generally get the best of other nations. People who have decided they will uproot themselves from that which is familiar, travel great distances, and then come here and settle. Take jobs that are not commensurate with superior skills that they have. devote themselves to bettering themselves economically, involving themselves in the life of this nation, so that if they don't necessarily feel or enjoy all that America can offer, their children can. If you look at the immigrant experience here, we constantly replenish ourselves in ways that other nations that are more homogenous do not. And I think that gives us a competitive advantage. So I think we need to stay true to our heritage. We also need to stay true to making this country better in the future, more dynamic. And I think if we allow, focus on this notion of comprehensive immigration reform, which again was something that, in a bipartisan way we were kind of moving towards. I think we certainly need to deal with the DACA kids, and that's fine. But we need to also focus on, solving this comprehensive problem that we have. We got to stay true to who we say we are as a nation.
We have a final word coming up.
All right, can I say just one thing before?
You're the boss.
Okay. We've talked about a lot of issues here today, and I'm really honored to be here with you, Mrs. Kennedy, and to be here with all of you. We've touched on a few things. What I would say is that you all have responsibilities as American citizens to be involved. I've talked about this need for a new American engagement. And you should understand the power that you have as American citizens. When I was a young man, an aroused American citizenry moved the nation closer to its founding ideals through the civil rights movement, stopped a war that was not supported by the American people. And that's the kind of power that we have that we too frequently do not use. We can make this nation better. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. But that only happens when people like you put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And I think that's the responsibility that we all have, to make sure that we do all that we can for the nation that we love, to make it better, to make it more perfect, to make it all that it can be. We have that capacity, we have that power, we have that ability. It is your responsibility. So get out there and do it.
Thank you. I'm Mary Grant. I have the privilege to be the president of the Kennedy Institute here, and I don't know what I could say to cap that off other than that's what we do here at the Kennedy Institute. This is the place that the senator envisioned the reality that his incredible partner, Vicki, has helped bring to life with so many in this room. I want to thank you all for coming this evening, for supporting us. We have elected officials here. We have alumni that worked with the senator. We have friends. We have neighbors. We have all of you. And most importantly, we have an opportunity through the work we do here every day to enrich and strengthen our democracy. And General Holder, I couldn't agree with you more. That's our collective and shared responsibility and obligation. Jeffrey Toobin, thank you for being with us. General Holder, thank you for being with us. Mrs. Kennedy, thank you for the leadership you provide here. I thank you all for coming. Please come back, support the work we're doing. Together we can make a great difference. Good evening, and we can thank you.